Zealand consumers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to come back, firstly thank the Minister for taking an earlier call and pick up on a couple of the key points that he made around non-discrimination, around regulatory forbearance and point-to-multi-point services, and then wish to take up a couple of matters in relation to the Kiwi share replacement by the TSO covered by the SOP today. On non-discrimination, the Minister rose to his feet to say that the opposition failed to understand the matter because, in fact, non-discrimination applied at both layer 0, which is the ducting, and layer 1, which is the dark fibre. And the Minister is strictly correct, but only telling half the story. Non-discrimination applies at those layers, but equivalence of inputs, the gold standard in the industry, does not. At least it does not to UFB fibre within the first 10-year period. And so I hope that the public can now be very clear about what is and is not covered. In other words, the gold standard applies only to the downstream services, not the ultra-fast broadband fibre, and the lowest standard, which is simple non-discrimination, applies across the lot, which is what the opposition said from the outset. Secondly, on the regulatory forbearance period, it's quite clear now that the SOP only repeals part of it, not all of it, as the government had initially said, proving again what an opaque and difficult, shadowy process there is, that this matter was not, as we said earlier, reported to the Select Committee, wasn't put out for public scrutiny. And what's interesting is that, of course, this emerged from a discussion between the government and the Māori Party behind closed doors. Well, one of the things which is shadowy about it is it's not clear whether the Māori Party got what it was asking for, which was the removal of regulatory forbearance, apparently, because this bill, this SOP, I doubt the members even read it, this SOP does not actually remove all the regulatory forbearance provisions, only part of it. And to quote from the explanatory note, the bill introduced certain undertakings. It removes regulatory forbearance, except it removes it from the bill as introduced, but retains an explicit restriction on the Telecommunications Commissioner recommending unbundling of point-to-multi-point Layer 1 services, which the Minister, to his credit, did amplify in his remarks. And he amplified them by underlining that he was moving at an ultra-fast pace, and these things would last until 2020. Good Lord, until 2020. It's 2012 now. That's another 8 years of restriction, the reason for which has never been made clear. Now, the Minister might say that he's had a private conversation with a former British minister. I don't know whether that minister was speaking in an official capacity, in a private capacity, or whether he was speaking in a capacity as someone hired by an industry participant or some lobbying firm, or what. Oh, it's quite common for former ministers or MPs to be hired by well-heeled telcos to persuade other ministers of the merits of their case. But again, this has emerged only in the debate on an SOP that's been rushed to the House, which has not had Select Committee consideration. It's part of a dismal legislative process. The next issue, of course, which has emerged only in the SOP is the Kiwi share. Now, for the public out there, the Kiwi share was the golden share left in telecom to guarantee the public's rights when the original telecom was privatised 20-odd years ago. And it was changed in part to a set of contracts or deeds for minimum service standard, which we called the TSO, or Telecommunications Service Obligation. But several critical aspects were left in the law, not in the deed. The first was that a minimum amount of telecom had to remain in New Zealand ownership, that only 49% of it, I think, could be owned offshore.
Order. I'm looking very closely. You're referring to the SOP. The KSO is actually not in Part 2. And I'll ask the member to come back to discuss Part 2. And if he wishes to speak about the SOP, it must relate to Part 2. The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you.
Point of order.
Point of order, Claire Curran.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. With respect, the The point of Part 2 is to address the replacement of the regulatory forbearance period with a new regulatory arrangement.
It's got nothing to do. It's got nothing to do with the Kiwi share obligation. Absolutely nothing to do. Stick to Part 2. The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you're quite correct that the substantive provisions appear in a different part of the bill, but, sir, the point I was making on behalf of the opposition was that the process around the introduction of the change to the Kiwi share, which was by SOP, which was not referred to a select committee, is identical to the point-to-multi-point services and the amendments to the regulatory forbearance bill, Mr. Chairman.
Stuart Nash.